taking that. Okay. What can you guys see right now? What are we?
Your screen.
Okay. Brilliant. Okay, so this is going to be like basically confirm the resolution for September and October. There's a vote for it, but all the camps choose a topic, and basically, since all the kids going to camp vote, this is going to be the topic. So just a bit of background, the current system of Medicare, basically Medicare only covers like certain people, very few amount of people. If you're old or have a disability or have like kidney failure, kind of a weird grouping. Medicaid is just for people impoverished, and it like varies greatly from state to state. It's both a federal and state program, where Medicare is just a federal program. And then that's just like a breakdown of who covers what. Health insurance, that's the average, but like obviously there's cheaper stuff, but like inherently the cheaper stuff is going to be a lot worse. So if you like into politics at all, you've been seeing like the Democratic debates, you know that there's like a big debate about Medicare and what to do with it. So Bernie Sanders proposed in 2019 the Medicare for All Act that establishes like a coverage of all US residents, provides automatic enrollment. You can read everything else I have on this slide. It's very similar to the Veterans Affairs healthcare, because that's also universal. Well, not universal because it only is veterans, but it's very similar to that. You can read the whole thing because it's a bill. You can just like Google whatever this link is, and you can read like the whole thing. It's quite long, but it's useful when you're doing research if you just want to like command F a certain word. So some of like the main stock arguments are going to just be like obviously improving access because it's going to expand everything. I think there's a pretty like nuanced linked with preventing pandemic with like where we are now. Like obviously by the time September rolls around, we don't know where it's going to be. But if like the second wave is still in the future, I would say that there's like a good argument saying that a second wave could be prevented if everyone in America has like good health insurance, because that makes it more accessible for testing, for just like getting healthcare. The economy, there's an argument that says because right now employers are supplying health insurance to their employees, then if we get rid of that like job covering your health insurance, they will have more money to then raise your wages, and that's good for the economy because there's more money like thrown around, stimulates growth. Also, there's an argument saying that it's just generally cheaper than the current system we have. Pretty like basic argument saying that private insurance is bad. You can read a bunch of stuff about just private insurance right now is terrible for everyone. One of those links is going to be price controls. We know if you watch the debates, Bernie Sanders is like really big on this insulin thing, right? Insulin is like, you need it to survive if you have type 1 diabetes, and it's like $400 within the US. So it's not affordable for the people who are in poverty, and like because of how like money works and like food, like obviously better quality food is going to be more expensive, so people in poverty are going to have less money and going to be more prone to diabetes, so they're going to be more prone to like need insulin, so that's why it's like particularly important. And I would say there's a big argument to be said about disenfranchised groups. So like I said, the people in poverty, expanding like LGBTQIA plus rights, because right now there's a big disparity in like there's certain laws that block people out. And then I think there's a very nuanced, like you have to weigh it really well, but about Indigenous people, because they are particularly affected by COVID-19. I cut a card that says like 60% of them are having increased mental health issues because of like the generational link between like the white man coming in the era of colonization and killing a bunch of them with a pandemic, right? So right now there's a global pandemic, and they're like remembered of that generational trauma. And then also they're a lot more likely to have diabetes. So that goes with the price controls. And I think the warranting there is because like their genes aren't prepared to deal with like the white man food with these processed sugar and flour. So if you run like those arguments, you're going to have to weigh it really like carefully, because you're going to be weighing against like these big impacts. So you're going to have to prove why like helping indigenous people is going to be more significant than whatever impact the neg is running.
Could you also put like women not being able to receive contraceptive care and stuff like that under that category? Would that become an ethical debate?
So that's what I'm worried about, right? So I think it depends where you're debating. So I think like reproductive rights is an argument of like for Medicare for all, but I think a lot of judges would just be like, oh, it's not that important, especially because it's like a really highly male concentrated like judging pool, and we're in like Pennsylvania.
But what if you said, I mean, like rich women can get abortions and all that stuff by the like anyway. So could you argue that it's just not fair to impoverish people and that would just go under that category, like still?
Um, I don't know. You could try it. Like, I think the link is going to like the impact is going to have to be bigger than just saying they're allowed to get abortions now, because it's contested like if abortions are ethical or not. So you're going to have to say like why abortions are uniquely good, right? Like
Yeah.
if you do like not so good debate, I think judges are a lot more liberal there and will be more open to that. But on like local circuit or like in Ohio, they won't really
Yeah.
do that. So that be careful of that. Oh, that's not working. Okay, so on the neg side, like with the free market, they're going to say because of competition, there's going to be more innovation with like coming up with medical ideas. We're also going to say because we're covering the entire nation, it's going to cost a lot more. There's a lot of evidence saying it doesn't. So I don't really think this is the strongest argument unless I'm missing something. There's like a meta study of like 22 studies saying that it's like $450 billion cheaper. So like, I don't think that's the best argument to win. Um, Again, competition, they're basically just saying competition is going to drive prices down, and it's also going to come up with more innovation. So it's kind of like the same link there. Price control is bad. I think in 2018, there was the topic was about price controls itself, about like checking big pharma. So there's going to be a lot of older kids who know like saying price control is bad, price control is good. So I'd be like careful knowing like both sides. You can go and look at cases from those and probably just run like the exact same thing, but you're going to have an answer to one of those big economic impacts. Like
Yeah, what are price controls?
price controls are basically like, so big pharma right now, because they have so much dark money in Congress, it's really hard for like any legislation to be passed saying you can't like raise the money, like you can't make insulin cost $400. It has to be capped at like 100. So that's like controlling the price. And in the Medicare for All bill, it allows the government as a legislative body to bargain with big pharma, like I think once a year to negotiate the price. And if they can't come up with a negotiated price, then it goes to like a general brand or something. I don't really understand. Like,
Wait, why would it be bad? Wouldn't that like bring down the price?
yeah. So yeah, they're saying like they concede that it does bring down the price, but what they're saying is like that's uniquely bad because it gets rid of funding for like research and development.
That comes from big pharma?
Yeah, comes from like that high. So they'll argue like that the price is necessary.
Okay.
And then quality of care. So there's going to say it hurts doctors, hurts hospitals, increases wait times. So like if you see a big Republican talking point is like why there'll be like all these other single payer nations have really long wait times, but if you come to the US, we have like the shortest wait times in the world. I think that is true, but also not really, because like Medicare for All takes away a lot of paperwork and it mainstreams a lot of stuff. Hurts hospitals and doctors. There's a lot of evidence saying that if everyone went to a Medicare for All system, they would like charge a lot less, and then doctors would have to be like laid off, and that's really bad. Again, you can like make a lot of nuanced links with the pandemic, right? So like since there's already a lot of people like losing their jobs and doctors losing their jobs, this is just going to make it more like really worse. Oh, also one more thing on the AF. I think that there's an argument to be said about automation, right? Like by 2030, like 40% of jobs are going to be automated away. And if you get your health insurance through your employer, if you're losing your job, you no longer have like your employer, right? So you no longer have health insurance. And then just generally, since these are a lot of stock arguments, I think you need to be like really careful and make sure you have something like different than the main stock argument. Like have your links like slightly more unique than like the common argument, because otherwise people can just read like basic block files. But if you make like the argument more nuanced, then you are going to be able to like get around them reading just like 2 pages of block files in rebuttal. Anyone have any questions on this topic? Okay. Okay, so case writing. Do we all know what these words mean? Okay, let's just run through them anyway. Okay, so claim, it's like what you're going to say is going to happen. So like if I'm saying Pepsi is better than Coke, that's my claim. My warrant is going to the reasoning behind my claim. So if someone like asks, why is Pepsi better than Coke? I'm going to say Pepsi is better than Coke because, and then my warrant is going to be because it has more sugar, right? So it tastes better. So then the impact is going to be like the final link to that. What happens? People say it should be in terms of like death and suffering, but if you want to weigh it in a different way, then you can have like rejecting racism, like helping indigenous people, preventing genocide, stuff like that, which isn't like typically death and suffering, but still is an important impact. A link is just connecting all three of those. Link chain is just having more links and connecting all three of those. Internal link is like a very nuanced thing. So like what it says here, A to B to C. So if you don't have like that internal link between your claim to warrant, then it still takes out your link chain. It's just a smaller part of the link. Weighing, it's just analytically comparing why one impact is going to be more important than the other. Framework is how the debate should be won. Uniqueness. A lot of people throw around the word uniqueness. When I first started debating, no one told me what it was, so I just thought it was like how often the argument was read. It's not what it means. It just means what changes in the status quo. And then bright line, I think that's a really important word to ask in cross. Like, when does your impact materialize? Like, people can say like really big impact, 700 million people go into poverty because of global recession. But you can ask like, when the bright line, when is that actually going to happen? And they're going to have a hard time actually telling you when like their case becomes true, if that makes sense. Okay, so what is a card? Do you guys see the whole screen, or is there little pictures of us on the right side? Okay.
Oh, you can tap like the little single rectangle, and then you only see the speaker.
Ah,
So,
okay.
yeah.
So do we all know what cut card is? Like, have we all used this before?
No.
Okay, so this is when you're doing your research, this is how everyone, like basically everyone formats their evidence. So you have your tagline, which is going to be explaining what the card actually says. Then you're going to have your cite. So like the date, the name of the article, blah, 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 blah. And then you're going to have the chunk of text, and the highlighted part's the important part. Everything that's like not important, you make it small, because then it just makes it easier to read for you. So if they call for evidence, you can just show them this. People on the local circuit, for some reason, just want to read articles, but on the national circuit, like people are fine with just reading this. So there's this thing called Site Creator and Card Cutter on Chrome. Can you see like my entire screen now? Okay, so it's these little things, they're extensions. So let's say, what was that? Let's go to this website, and let's say I want to like make a card out of this block of text, right? So we're copying that block of text. We can auto do this, and it fills in the title, website, blank. We put in like the author, tag, cut card, organization, blah, 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 generate. And then that's going to copy it. So we can just command V it, and it's already formatted for us, which I did not learn about till recently. And that is very helpful. Then just like when you're doing that, make sure you're ethical about cutting your card. Don't change would likely recommend, like likely adopt to definitely adopt. Like don't edit words in these actual things. You can change them in your case, but don't change them here because that's like not what your expert is saying. Also, make sure that you actually have a site. Some people also put like credentials for your author, like what they do, because you can just like people cite like Buma Nishikawa, but I don't know who he is and why we should trust his word. So some people will throw in the expert site. I don't because I'm lazy. So some casing norms, 700, about 700 words. As said yesterday, it's getting faster. 3 contentions, blah, 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 blah. Really important. We're talking about real people, so make sure you like understand what you're talking about and don't like brush over how big what you're talking about is debating, right? So like don't just throw around the impact like 700 people are going to poverty. Understand like what that means and don't like mock it, if that makes sense. I also think it's like really unethical if you're going to go for a more nuanced argument like rejecting racism, like actually believe in like the arguments you're saying. Well, not to a super extent, but don't be like super racist and then read like rejecting racism is good. Have integrity. So basically avoid like if I was debating the Belt and Road topic from last September, October, don't say BRI because you guys have no clue what the BRI is if I don't explain it, right? So how is a judge going to know what I'm talking about? So have like the first time you use a certain word, explain it, and then you can use like that type shorthand for the rest of your case.
Wait, should we like take a sentence or two or whatever in our case to explain the topic? Because like I think we did that last year and we weren't sure if we should.
I wouldn't because it just takes too much time. But like if the resolution's like, should the EU join the Belt and Road Initiative, don't jump straight into BRI, especially on like the first like debate of that month, because the parent judges are gonna have no clue what a BRI is.
How much do like the judges know about the topic?
It depends what circuit you're debating on. So, and also what the topic is, right? So I would say a lot more people are going to know about this topic than like the Venezuela topic. The NAT circuit, since most of the judges there are going to be like coaches or people fresh out of high school, they will know what they're talking about, hopefully. And also since they've just had more rounds, they've heard like a lot of arguments. Squirrely cases are just like link chains that don't really make sense, that like aren't believable, right? So like if I was just saying something like really out there that no one's ever heard of before, but I'm just running it to like try to blindside you, like that's unethical. You could do it, I just don't think it's the best thing to do. Time sucks are just when you put like a small contention at the top of your case because you need to take up time of the rebuttal. Sometimes I do that just because I need to like fill space because I only have like 500 words. So I'll put in like a stock contention, but I wouldn't put it in there just to waste their time because that takes away from like actually debating substance. And then abusive definitions framework. There's a lot of people I know in the December offensive cyber optics resolution, there was a team from Upper Sinclair who read like this really dumb framework that made it really hard for one side to win. So I wouldn't do that because then again, takes away from like having an actual debate about an important issue. If you come up against a team doing that in like first cross, you can actually just ask how, like under your framework, how do we win, right? If they can't tell you how you win, then it's obviously abusive framework and you can just tell the judge like drop them because it's abusive framework. And it's like taking away from an actual debate. Again, cite tards properly. A big thing that's like coming in is paraphrasing evidence, which just means like you read the whole article and then take out what you want from it, right? So you're paraphrasing like what the entire article says. Be careful around this. I would still cut a card and then you can paraphrase the card, but make sure you have something if they call for it instead of just like sending them the entire article, because that's going to take a bunch of prep time for them to read the entire article to like get like the 3 random words you clipped. Just still have like the cut card. It can be like a bunch of text highlighted, but analysis, that's just makes it easier for like a non-super tech judge to understand. Tech means flow. Warn out your arguments. Don't say A happens, B happens, C happens. Explain why this happens, because you look really stupid if I, like in cross, I ask why, like why does your impact materialize, and then you just read your cards again. Like you will lose like almost every round if you don't understand why it happens and you don't explain it in your case. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, so this is going to be like, you're going to see a lot of the one contention case. So what we're seeing a lot recently is developing a narrative. So your whole case is centered around like a central focus, and you're developing the story, and it makes it easier for judges to understand it. You can have like multiple subpoints, like subpoint A, subpoint B, subpoint C, all leading to one impact or leading to like 3 separate impacts with the same theme. Some like negatives for this, obviously, because it's all the same theme, it makes it easier for the opponents to like understand what you're going for. And if it's not subsectioned, then they just take out one link and you don't have like a backup to go for. Narrative development, so that's what I was talking about with like painting that picture. It's really easy to do. Like before the round, you can understand like what you're talking about in summary, then you just paint this really clear picture for the judge, making it like personal. Well, not like super personal, but somewhat personal. Wait, hold on. Someone might be trying to join. Okay, never mind. And then it makes it more realistic for the judge. So this is going to be like specifically good for the parent judge who doesn't really know the topic. Because
Wait, if we're like against someone who's doing this, do we try to use like in rebuttal? Would I like try to argue against the entire contention or like each sub point?
It depends how much time you have, and like I would say it really varies like from situation to situation. Like if you think you can give like an overview to their entire case, like saying why it's like not important or why it doesn't happen, and then attack the like small links, or just go for the small links. Okay, so where to start? When you research, these are some like tips. If you put quotations around a singular word in Google, then make sure every search that pops up has that word. Same with the minus, that does the opposite. Google Scholar, it's just like Google, but for scholarly articles. Think tanks, they do a bunch of research on this. Like if you debated the UBI topic, there was like the Heritage Foundation had like a ton of stuff about it. Outline.com, if you're like the New York Times, they have a lot of paywalls. If you copy the original article, put it in an outline, there's a good chance that they have the article for you. And then also there, if you have a friend who is in university, a lot of university accounts have like links to these free websites, so you could ask them for it. Anything that you think might be useful, I would suggest you cut that card, because you might come up with an argument later that you're like, oh, I needed that, and you have no clue where to find it because you went through like 50 articles that basically all say the same thing. When you start research, don't like start researching big pharma bad, because then you're going to only look for big pharma bad, and you're not going to have like a big understanding of the topic, and people are going to ask you really basic questions about the topic in Crossfire, and you're going to have no clue. Right? So like for the UBI topic, I would ask people like, how are they getting the money? They would have no clue, because they only like understood their nuanced link about domestic abuse. So once you understand like the basic topic and you have like a bunch of cards cut, plan out your case, work backwards. So understand what the like terminalized impact is going to be, and make sure that it outweighs like it's a like big enough impact that you're going to be able to beat other teams, even if they still have access to the impact at the end of the round. So you're going to want to make sure that it's important enough. Again, so just like work backwards, impact, and then up. So find what impact you want, and then find the links later, because the impact is just the most important thing. Okay, so now we can look at some examples. Why is this not there? Okay, so this was a one contention case from the Venezuela topic. So Justin wrote this, there's a bit of contextualization at the top, and then he puts in the tagline of like, blah, 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 we affirm. So their sole contention is going to be about extending a lifeline. So they do this contextualization again here, which paints a very clear picture that Venezuela is not doing well and how like the economy is in shambles. So then they give 3 like subsections with different links, right? So we're going to see medicine, and then it has an impact of its own, which is about death for tens of thousands, rather than second link, food supply, and then its own, actually this one doesn't have an impact. No, it does, just kidding. Famine will occur within a year. And then third, lifting sanctions, political momentum, and then it has its own impact. So it's 3 like very distinct subsections, but they all have like the same theme about why like lifting sanctions is specifically unique to helping the Venezuelan people, instead of like a link that all jump around different places. How do I get back? And then I think, oh, this is just a standard case. So this is for the UBI topic. So right here, my screen's really bad. We have the claim is up here. So we're saying that 43% of blah, blah, blah are children. And then we continue to saying the claim all the way down to here, which saying instead of UBI is going to cut this. So our claim is these children will not get Medicaid because a UBI is cutting this. Then we have our warrant, which is the expert opinion, which says that it costs a lot of money. A UBI does not offer that much money. And then the final link is going to be about the impact, right? So we explain why the impact is uniquely important by saying that like pulling people out of poverty is good as children because it takes like a lot longer. And then we also really clearly warrant out like why this happens, right? We don't just say, oh, because Medicaid is being like dropped, children are going into poverty. We say like it costs a lot of money and they're putting themselves at risk, right? And then we have our second contention. Again, you can like break up contentions into subpoints itself, but since if you're doing like multiple contentions, it's going to be a lot shorter. And I would format all your cases to make it the most readable you can. Some people just do cut cards, but I don't like that because that's hard to read. Oh, one more thing for topics. I think on both sides, you can make a case about like Trump being good or bad. But like I said, for reproductive rights, that's going to be hard to win in certain states. So the argument there would be like, if Trump passes Medicare for all, he's going to look more credible as a president, win like November. And then we can say things like, it's going to hurt climate change because he's not going to do anything, and that leads to extinction. Or we can say that's going to be good because he like increases US global hegemony and that's preventing like a war.
But wouldn't that be really hard to argue that Trump is going to pass that because he's like really against it?
I mean, but that's what the resolution says, right? So the US government should enact it. So if we're affirming, we're saying that like this will happen.
Oh, okay.
So like even if he is against it, it most likely, like realistically, won't happen. But
when we're arguing, it's going to be September, October. So we would be arguing for like definitely for Trump or for like any president because we don't know who's going to win.
I would say like if someone like pushes back on that, just say if you affirm the resolution now, you're affirming it like at this instant, which means Trump is
Okay.
the sitting president.
Got it.
Okay. Let's do rebuttal. Okay, so some more word. Frontlining, it's basically going to be in summary or second rebuttal when you respond to their rebuttal. So let's say like I say in my case I say Pepsi is better than Coke. They say Coke is better than Pepsi because like the can is red, and now me frontlining would be the color doesn't matter. So I'm saying why my argument is still correct. Overviews, they're becoming a lot more popular. Oh, that made it small. A lot more popular in like modern debate, and they're really just broad responses to either like their specific links or their entire case. So there's going to be these 4 types of overviews. So the first is offensive overviews, which going to garner some type of offense for you to what you're trying to win. So this is a speech doc. It's basically what was just being read in rebuttal. So right here is going to be the offensive part of the overview, right? We tell you that if you vote AF, it's going to increase the GDP by 12.5%. And that is like new offense. It wasn't read in case. It's like completely new in rebuttal. A defensive argument is going to be the same thing. So you're going to read it on their case instead of your, like on their flow instead of your flow. And it's going to like mitigate their impacts or completely wipe out their link chain. So this is a defensive argument, which says that basically all their studies are flawed because they're not universal, right? So that's indicting their evidence. Observation uniqueness, you're basically like stating what's happening in the status quo. So right here, this is the same speech doc. It's the Yang evidence, right? So we're just saying like, this is what's happening in the status quo. They're unexpected to like have to live paycheck to paycheck, right? So this can happen in a variety of issues, saying like, you can use this to frame the debate. So let's say we were talking about like the Venezuelan topic, and we can read a uniqueness overview, which says like in the status quo, thousands of people are dying, which is why we have to act like uniquely now. And then framework overview basically frames the round in rebuttal. So this was a case read for the Nats topic about charter schools. So these are just a big old framework about why you should prioritize helping Native Americans instead of like their big impacts, right? So we have like, oh, what just happened? I don't know why my email just popped up. What is going on?
You only see half of your screen. There we go.
Yeah, I don't know why my email just kept popping up. Okay, so we have like 4 links about weighing, right? So death prereqs, education, utilitarianism, like excludes Native Americans, like debt, you should prioritize helping Native Americans because like the US owes them, and fighting cognitive bias, right? So this is a big old overview you read in rebuttal that again, going to be new in rebuttal, or you could also read it in summary, but most people read in rebuttal. Completely.
Wait, I'm kind of confused about the overview thing. Like, does this happen like, when would you do this in rebuttal? Like in the beginning or like?
Yeah, so top of the speech, it goes on the very top of your flow. So it's not responding to any of their case or your case. You just like read a block of.
What's the point of it if it doesn't respond to the case?
So it depends on like what you're trying to do, right? So you can either use it as offense, like these 4 things. So basically it's a way to kind of blindside them because they haven't heard it before. So it's going to be like a new argument brought up now, or if it's defensive, so you write it on their flow, then it's just like a big overarching response to why their like entire case is bad.
Okay, so like if they were doing like a one contention case and like you did the defensive, that would be like you start with why their whole thing is bad and then you go into the subpoints?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then you got the framework, right?
Mhm.
It's just framing the round. So a turn, again, these are being used increasingly more recently. Impact turn, basically it says like the impact isn't actually bad. So some people would say like that economic decline is good because it prevents like our environment from collapsing, right? So there's an argument to be said that in times of economic prosperity, environmental change will never happen because of capitalism. So we are saying because the economy is collapsing, this is actually good because we prevent extinction. So this is read on their flow in response to like one of their links, and then they have to respond to it because it becomes offense for you. A link turn is when you say like one of their like niche links isn't necessarily bad, like taxes increase will hurt the economy, blah, 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 blah. And then blocks are basically just responses to stock arguments. And so I just started calling them comebacks because I thought that was a more fun word than answer to. Some people will just say A2, that's what that means. So I can just read these straight off in rebuttal if they say like black teachers are good in charter schools, right? So I just read this entire piece of text and then I have it tagged so I know what like my response is. So this is a non-unique and then a bunch of D links. Like mitigates, and then this one is a D link and then another mitigate. So it's really easy for me to understand what my blocks are. So if I were a second speaker, I would write blocks. First speaker typically writes case. And then you should both understand what is being like read both of each other's. So you understand what they're going to read in rebuttal or like what they're going, obviously what the case is. And then since you understand what your blocks say, you should like be able to read these quite quickly and then add analysis between each block. And just because you have 3 like responses to ELL students doesn't mean you have to read all 3, right? So let's say like their link is going to be more nuanced than what you have a response to. So you only read the first one and then you read a bunch of analysis, right? You just pick and choose which ones you think are best for the situation. Okay, so if you are, if you're going first, you're speaking first, you have the entire 4 minutes to just lay defense on your opponent's case. So basically, this is going to be good for you because you can just give a bunch of responses and they can be like well thought out, well timed, and like specifically target each of their links. Second rebuttal, you have like, some people do a 2-2 split, but I would suggest like a 3-1 split. So your first minute is going to be responding to what the rebuttal in front of you just said. You're going to frontline your responses. Some judges say that if you don't frontline then, you can't frontline in summary. So then you just like concede to their defense. So you're gonna wanna make sure that you frontline there. Does that make sense? That face makes it look like it's a no.
Oh, wait, so if I was the second rebuttal, wait, why do I have to, like, what if I want to spend the whole 4 minutes on my own case? Like, why would that affect summary?
So like what's widely accepted as like a rule is just you have to frontline. Because otherwise like it's trying to make it more fair for the first and second speaker, I guess, so you can't collapse later.
What's collapsing?
Collapsing is when you, so let's say I have 2 contentions and my second contention has like 2 subpoints. So collapsing, they give like a really good rebuttal to my first contention and my second subpoint and my second contention, right? So in my summary, I'm going to go up there and only talk about my first subpoint of my second contention. They like, the judge shouldn't, but if they're just a bad judge, they'll vote off anything. Shouldn't vote off of the things you don't talk about in summary or final focus. And since like you should have an impact there, you should be able to win by just talking about what you've collapsed onto.
Okay, so like if you think that you're like losing a point, you can just drop it and strengthen your other points, and the judge can't vote off of what you lost.
Yeah, well, you don't necessarily lose it. The only time you have to bring up something that you want to like kicking is when you like get rid of something, is if they put a turn. You have to respond
Okay.
to turns because otherwise it's offense for them, right? So then also it's important because second rebuttal, you can collapse earlier, like we were just talking about. And then you also have more time to frontline and summary because your second speaker already like started saying your front lines. So spray and pray method or summary. So on your left, this is the spray and pray, when you're just going to give a ton of responses and it's going to be very time consuming for them to frontline in summary or second rebuttal. They're probably going to be pretty surface level because you're just giving like a ton of responses at this point. Whereas submarining, this is going to be like more of your second rebuttal, where you're going to just attack like certain links of their case, right? Because you don't have the entire time, the entire 4 minutes to just talk about why like every single point is bad. You're just going to pick like the weakest point and then give like a really good, like well-warranted response and then move on. Okay, so when you're going through your rebuttal, important, remember the 5 S's. So signposting is just like, now we're going to move on to their second contention, or like look at their second warrant of their second contention, right? So it's really easy to then for both your partner, the opponents, and the judge to flow along with where your responses are. It's really bad. Like I've seen rounds where they're like, now go into our case, their case, our case, their case. That gets really confusing. And most likely the judge isn't going to like be able to flip paper fast enough and write down everything you're saying. So your rebuttal is not going to be as strong. So then you're going to want, after you tell the judge where you are, explain what your opponent is, what your opponent is saying, right? So you can't just be like, now talk about like their Atlanta evidence. You need to explain what their Atlantic evidence says. Then you say like why it's bad, explain, like warrant out your counterclaim, right? Don't just say their evidence is bad. Explain their evidence is bad because it doesn't like look at the entire nation and only looks at one state. And then explain what this means for the round. So let's say like I take out one of their links and then say, I tell the judge, don't give them access to their impact, right? So I'm telling the judge that you can no longer vote off their like big poverty impact because I got rid of this one link. So terminal defense means that they no longer have access to their impact at all. So you can literally like just say like this phrase down here. And they have to frontline this, otherwise they will have no access to their impact at all. So that's really big. Refutation. So there's like 4 things you can go about doing to each one of their links, right? So we can reduce, we can either mitigate. It goes in order of like the easiest to the most like the biggest impact. So the first like easiest thing to do is to reduce, right? So let's say that their evidence says like that Medicare for all is going to cost like $7 billion, but our evidence says it only costs $3 million and it's more recent. So they're going to still have impact to their, it costs more impact. There's going to still have access to their, it costs more impact, but their like actual impact is going to be a lot smaller because of my rebuttal. That makes sense? Okay. So indicts is just their evidence just being wrong. So a really easy indict is just logic. They have no warrant, right? I can ask them in Crossfire, what's their warrant? They don't explain it. And then I just come up here and rebuttal and say, they have no warrant. They don't explain it. Prefer our evidence because we actually explained to you what happened. And then we have also evidence, which has 3 different types. So let's look at those. Okay, so this is right here. The answer to the Roosevelt study is going to be an evidence indict. So first, it's marked, this is from the block, it's marked with an indict, so I know what I'm reading. It's the tagline right here, so it's easier for the judge to follow. And it tells you why the study is flawed. This one says it's just misleading because it misrepresents the data. Now this one says it's critically flawed because of the methodology, and this one provides a better model, right? So we're going to say that their studies are going to be like very bad, and then we can't just tell them, the judge, that their studies are bad. We need to offer them an alternative to look at, right? Because they can come up here in summary and frontline that like their studies are actually good. And since we offered them no alternative, the judge is probably going to still prefer their study. But if we offer them our own alternative, then the judge has to weigh like our analytics for why each study is going to be better than the other. So then warranting indictment would look like this, right? So this evidence says charter schools have 35% more Black teachers. So I've read this card and it says the evidence is based solely in North Carolina, right? So then I tell the judge, like their evidence is only from North Carolina, make them explain why this can be applied across the entire nation, right? Like it doesn't really make sense for one study about North Carolina to be applied across the United States. So I'm asking them for their warranting about why their study is still good. Or maybe their study just says like, there's more Black teachers in charter schools. And I can just ask them, why is that true? And if they can't explain it, then they're not going to look too good. And it's probably going to be really easy to give an answer about why that's not actually true. And then outweigh. Basically, you can concede stuff. So let's say I mitigate their impact and give like a really good indict to one of their links. And then I can say to the judge, even if you don't buy that, we outweigh because of this, right? So this is going to be a backup mechanism because like some of the judges just think your rebuttals are going to be bad. But you can say, even if we don't win that, we're going to outweigh them because of blank. So that just like goes into further. And then again, turns are going to be really important because let's say both cases, like there's a lot of defense, but I just have one turn on their case. I don't have any impacts on our case. They don't have any impacts on their case, but I just have that one turn going for me. I can win solely on that turn. Iron Man versus Straw Man, right? So let's say they like read some really like unique kind of unique thing off of a stock argument, right? So I can come up here and straw man them, which means I tell the judge that their argument is like basically just the stock argument and give a bunch of rebuttals to this very stock argument, but it's not actually addressing like the unique link of their case. That's going to be like useful against bad teams, but it's not really going to work against a good team, which can say you don't interact with our warranting, right? So to look better, you're going to want an Iron Man where you actually address their warranting, and that's going to be a rebuttal filled with a lot more analytics than just like your pre-prepared blocks. Anyone have any questions about rebuttals? Okay. So second half of the round. Summary, oh wait, just kidding. Lingo. Extending means you draw that arrow in your flow and it just keeps going, right? So you're gonna wanna bring it up in every speech. If it's really important, you bring it up. Extending doesn't just mean talking about your impact. It means talking about your entire link chain and explaining it, right? Drop means something that you're not being extended. Weighing, I've talked about that. Voters, people say voters in Final Focus. I think it's kind of stupid, but they'll say like voters, the economy. We are winning on the economy because of blank. It's like a stepping stool to just reading a normal Final Focus. Backlining is a response to frontline, right? So they read their case, I read a rebuttal saying why their case is wrong. They read a frontline saying why their case is right. I backline it saying why my rebuttal is still correct. Okay, summary. A lot of people say most important speech of the round because like a lot of mistakes happen in summary. So first, you're going to want to collapse your case, right? Because if I have 3 contentions and I am trying to go for everything, that's not going to fit in 3 minutes. Like I don't have enough time in 3 minutes to explain my opponent's case and my own case, talking about 3 entire contentions. So before the round even starts, like when you're writing your case, you should probably talk to your second speaker and understand what you're going to want to go to. Obviously, this isn't going to be the same in every round because people's like responses are going to be different, but like 9 times out of 10, you're going to collapse onto the same thing because you're just most comfortable with it. It's the biggest impact, and like teams don't put a lot of defense on it. Again, if this is different, you can literally just look down in your flow, look for the cleanest way, right? So look where they didn't put a lot of rebuttals, where you frontlined really well, and where there's like not a lot of the opposite color of pen. So what some people do for the strategy is they go up there and use 1 minute of their time explaining your case to the judge. You just don't even talk about the rebuttals. You just go down your case explaining what your case says. So claim warrant impact, you can write this out. Like if you need help with this, you write it out at the beginning, like when you're writing your case. You can have pre-written like short summary of your entire case that you can just read at the beginning of your summary. Then after you do that, you're going to want to frontline any of their responses. Or you can do that while they're doing that. So you're going to want to make sure you respond to turns like we talked about. Even if you collapse, like even if you kick a contention, you're going to want to respond to turns. Frontline responses to your own case, because if you don't frontline, you have no impact. Extend your partner's frontline if they made them, if you're speaking second. And then go on to their case. I would always suggest starting on your case, then going to their case, because that makes sure that you have like impacts at the end of the day. So going on to their case, you're going to want to expend your partner's rebuttal. Probably not all like 5 responses that they laid down. If they laid a bunch of responses, you're going to want to pick the one that either your opponents didn't like respond frontline to, or the ones that you just think are going to be the strongest at the end of the day. Make sure you extend turns, because as I like pointed out, that's a really big deal. You can also add your own responses if you're in first summary. I wouldn't do that in second summary, because that's a lot of teams will say that's unfair because they can't respond to it except in final focus. You're going to want to begin to have a clear weighing strategy between your summary and final focus so the judge understands what you're going for. Any questions on summary? Okay. Final focus, basically the exact same thing summary just said, right? You're going to want to talk about, oh, who's this? Lawrence? Talk about exactly what they just said. It should basically be the exact same order. And then you're going to want to write your judge's ballot for them, right? You shouldn't leave them up with like figuring out what's more important, a recession or like biological, like biodiversity collapsing. You want to explain exactly why you won. And you can literally, like, I've seen a lot of like high level debaters say directly to the judge, and because of this, you can stop your round and write your ballot right now, or this impact ends the round right now. A lot of people also say they messed up big time when they didn't respond to this, right? So you can like kind of like trash the other team by just talking to the judge, saying exactly how they messed up, and the judge in their head is going to be like, oh yeah, they didn't respond to that. That was a big mistake. So when you extend your impacts, don't just extend, if you vote for us, 7 million people go into poverty. You're going to want to explain why this happens, because sure, I could vote on poverty, but I don't understand what that has to do with the resolution, right? So I need to warrant out, explain why this impact is going to be uniquely to our case. Like go crazy in the speech, right? You got 2 minutes. We can watch rounds later, but it's going to be, most people go pretty fast in this speech because you're just trying to cover the entire round. Make sure you extend like everything that's important. And as I said, go ham. You can just like talk poorly on the other team at that point. How much time do you have? Okay. Does everyone have like paper to flow on? Lawrence, you want to get paper?
Grab paper.
There's no way you have paper just chilling in your bed.
Paper.
Okay. What round do we want to watch? Do we want to watch the Belt and Road Initiative one or the Venezuela topic?
I'm leaning not Belt and Road because that was confusing.
Not Belt and Road? Oh, okay. So this is videos on PF. PF videos. They just post a bunch of rounds recorded. They're high-level rounds. There's a pretty interesting study by Beyond Resolved about female representation in debate. So it found like there weren't a lot of female rounds posted, but I tried, like if I'm going to show a round, I'll try to have like at least one female presenting person in the round. So
Thanks.
no, it's important. So flow the round. Then tomorrow we will do redos. So we'll watch the round again. So today we'll just flow the round. Tomorrow we'll watch the round. You can flow it again if you want, but then before their like summary or final focus, we'll stop it, and then we'll break up into like smaller groups, and then you'll give their summary or final focus for them. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Like you're debating in the round.
Ben intentional punishing generosity.
Can you hear that?
According to Goldman of the Atlantic.
Could you hear that?
Better, but it's still really like fuzzy.
Ben and I affirm intention one is punishing generosity. According to Goldman of the Atlantic Council, in 2005, Venezuela created PetroCaribe, a program which supplied 18 Latin American nations with cheap oil to meet half their energy needs. Sanchez of UCV finds that PetroCaribe governments used the savings they got from cheaper fuel, which represented 10 to 20% of their budgets, to finance 750 social programs. The FAO reports that these programs cut malnutrition in half, created 180,000 jobs, and increased food availability by 17% across the region. Toll of the University of Amsterdam concurs, finding that overall, the PetroCaribe program boosted the GDP per capita of participant nations by 11%. Unfortunately, Rawls of the ICG finds that U.S. sanctions have undermined the program, as they prohibit banks from routing payments to Venezuela's government, preventing Latin American nations from buying its oil. The ACA quantifies this effect, finding that American sanctions reduced the program by 97%. As a result, Rawls finds that now, as PetroCaribe nations pay more for oil, they've had to gut social programs, leading to a 50% increase in malnutrition in countries like Haiti. Contention 2 is cutting the lifeline. U.S. sanctions target Venezuelan oil production in two ways. First, according to Rodriguez of Harvard, in 2017, the U.S. imposed financial sanctions, which prevent U.S. banks from lending to Venezuelan state-owned entities, including its national oil company, Petróleos. The Washington Post finds that this ban caused oil production to fall 25%, 3 times faster than ever before. Second, according to Morgenstern of Petersburg University, in 2019, the U.S. imposed an oil embargo on Venezuela, which crippled its revenue since it shipped over half its oil to the U.S. The U.S. also threatened to sanction any actor that continued to conduct business with Petróleos. So even when Venezuela turned to sell to other countries, it was only able to recoup 13% of the revenue it had lost. For this reason, Rodriguez finds that the embargo cost Venezuela $17 billion, a decline in oil revenue of 67%. Problematically, Morgenstern writes that oil accounts for 98% of Venezuela's export revenue and is the main way that its government acquires the US dollars it needs to purchase goods on the global market. Indeed, Rodriguez writes that Venezuela uses its dollar reserves to buy food and medicine that it then distributes to citizens. It also uses dollars to subsidize private companies so that they can buy necessities abroad and then sell them within Venezuela. As such, Dale of the Washington Post quantifies that revenue earned from oil is a source of 95% of all dollars used to import food and medicine. However, sanctions have cut off this lifeline, as the Wall Street Journal finds that they have cost Venezuela over half its reserve dollars, forcing it to cut total imports by 44%. This plunge in imports harms Venezuelans in two ways. First is collapsing healthcare. According to Zackerson of UChicago, Venezuela's healthcare system is mainly funded by oil money, as the government distributes 230 million doses of medicine to public hospitals annually. Yet, S&P reports that as sanctions decimate oil revenue, Venezuela has seen a 98% drop in medicine imports. The result has been a health crisis, as HRW quantifies that 85% of medicines face shortages, up from 60% before sanctions, with the UN reporting that 300,000 Venezuelans are at risk of death due to these shortages. Second is empty stomachs. Prior to sanctions, the monthly review reports that the government was successfully combating hunger, as it sent 8 out of every 10 Venezuelans weekly food packages. However, this effort recently ended as sanctions forced the government to cut food imports by 71%. The result is widespread starvation, with the Financial Times reporting that malnutrition rose from 6 to 21% after the U.S. imposed its oil embargo. Hunger is now claiming many lives, with Reuters reporting that malnutrition will kill 280,000 children annually if food imports are not restored to pre-sanction levels. Additionally, the WHO reports that 1/3 of children are now stunted, a condition that limits brain development and increases long-run health problems. For these reasons, stunting makes it 33% less likely for one to escape poverty, with the WHO estimating that stunting will cost Venezuela $481 billion in long-term economic damage if unsolved. Fortunately, lifting sanctions now could reverse these harms, as the CSIS quantifies that oil production would double, foreign reserves would grow by $28 billion, and Venezuela could import the food and medicine it so sorely needs once again. Thus, we affirm.
Okay, so what was the makeup of their case? Was it one contention, multiple contentions?
It looks like 2.
Two contentions? And they extended a pretty clear narrative, right, about, again, helping the people. Right? So did everyone get what their impacts were?
Like the food and medicine and stuff.
Yeah.
And then with the economy and all that.
Who wants to explain what their link chain was? Lawrence?
I didn't follow that correctly.
Oh my God, Lawrence. What about you, Davina?
Sorry, say that again. My dad was yelling.
Can you explain like their link chain, like from their claim, more impact?
Oh, yeah. With the 1/3 kids, 1/3 of the kids are stunted, which causes them to not be able to escape poverty, which makes them dead, basically.
No, like start bigger picture. That's like their impact. Start at like what the resolution has to do with it.
Oh, okay. Yeah. 1 second. Is it like the... Wait, sorry. Wasn't really paying attention.
Anyone got that?
I'll try. So the sanctions stopped them from shipping oil to the US, and that reduced a lot of their revenue from oil, and they used a lot of that revenue to buy or to supply food and healthcare to citizens. And since they have less money, they can't give as much to the citizens. Thus, the citizens are going hungry and aren't having the proper medicine and healthcare they need.
Sounds about right. Anyone else?
And what their first contention was talking about the social programs. And so they said the sanctions were punishing generosity. And so the money from oil funded social programs, and those social programs cut malnutrition in half and then boosted the GDP. And the sanctions hurt the programs, and it decreases 97%. And then that went on to the second contention, which was about the hurting healthcare and the hunger and all that.
Yeah, so that's a pretty stock argument, right? We all debated in Venezuela and we all heard that argument. So obviously stock arguments are going to have really easy to have a block written to it because you've heard it 1,000 times. But obviously they're going to be stock because they're good, right? So don't just throw out a stock argument because, oh, everyone's going to read that. Understand everyone's reading that because it's good. So if you understand the front lines to that case, you'll do really well, right? So these people were at octo finals at a national tournament, so they're obviously pretty good. They also weren't reading too fast, and they were just like going at a pretty average speed, probably like 600, 700 words. All right, so everyone ready for the neg constructed?
Hey, there's like a super loud. Hold on. Okay.
Okay. Adriano 9 negate, and contention 1 is liberalization. Nicolas Maduro's control over Venezuela largely relies on his support from the military, as he bribes and provides him with resources. Sanctions have put this at risk by cutting off finances. The CSIS in 2019 writes that sanctions have reduced Maduro's control over state institutions and assets, straining his inner circle and limiting his ability to finance his regime's illegal activities, decreasing public confidence. Thus, Maduro has been forced for the first time to align interests with the people, as concessions and reforms are the only way for him to garner political support and access resources. Vice 19 of the Wall Street Journal finds that the regime has largely stopped enforcing price controls that led to dire food shortages. Rojas 18 furthers that the government also got rid of DIPRO, a subsidized exchange rate reserved for essential goods such as food and medicine, which contributed to the country's soaring inflation rates. Vice concludes that the easing of state controls is a response to U.S. financial sanctions. This is key, as Purcell 19 of The Conversation finds that the economic crisis in Venezuela is grown from the government's attempts to set prices for basic goods and maintain currency exchange controls. As a result of these reforms, inflation has decreased, as Leah 20 of Bloomberg finds that inflation has abated to an estimated annual rate of 6,500%, which is down significantly from estimates, as Leah continues forecast predicted inflation to reach 10 million% by the end of 2019. This is critical, as Martin 19 of Bloomberg explains that the nation's inflation rate caused prices to soar, producing hunger, leading thousands of Venezuelans to flee every day, with 3 million already living abroad. Contention 2 is aid. Maduro used to block aid into Venezuela. Lee 19 explains that after blocking aid, officials were hit with more intense targeted sanctions. The increasing severity of sanctions forced Maduro to let in aid, as the New York Times 19 finds that after years of denying a crisis and blocking aid, Maduro allowed the Red Cross to send in medical equipment, marking the beginning of a large-scale relief campaign sent to help 650,000 Venezuelans. Contention 3 is the oil curse. Oil has devastated Venezuela. Rossi 11 of the IAA finds that oil wealth in Venezuela is a double-edged sword, making the nation dependent on one commodity and relying on the government for all economic activity. Conzichas of Cato thus concludes that the institutional failure of Venezuela's resource dependency prevented them from being one of the most well-off countries in the world. Privatization is key, as Minaldi 17 finds the Venezuelan oil industry and the broader economy are intrinsically linked. Venezuela must re-privatize nationalized companies to get the country back on track. Fortunately, sanctions have facilitated this shift, as our Mario 19 explains that new measures on sanctions do not include Venezuela's private sector. Cohen 19 finds that for the first time ever, Venezuela's government and opposition have discussed allowing private companies in joint ventures with state oil company PDVSA. In the short term, oil privatization kickstarts the Venezuelan economy. As Atlas Net 19 writes that by allowing private companies to participate in the oil industry again, the sector will become more efficient and lucrative, driving broader economic freedom. In the long term, it forces full diversification in the public sector. Malin 17 explains that Venezuela's reliance on oil is an economic straitjacket, committing them to diversification of the economy. For example, Nisberg 18 finds that agriculture is the main industry to be developed. He continues that protectionist policies and the removal of price controls will grow food production, which is the key to growth and a decrease in reliance on oil. Overall, Reuters 19 explains that this year there was a 155% increase in other state-owned sectors in Venezuela. Shifting away from oil dependency is the best thing that a country can do, as Kakanov 18 explains that a 10% increase in oil share decreases GDP by 7% in the long run. Patrick of The Atlantic in 2012 confirms, finding that because resource dependency concentrates wealth into the hands of the elites and disincentivizes the growth of other economic sectors, these countries are often the worst developed, characterized by high poverty and high inequality. Ross of Princeton in 2011 thus concludes that because high oil revenues remove government accountability by eliminating the need for public taxation, oil-dependent states are 50% more likely to be autocratic, leading to poor health outcomes for citizens. Thus, we negate.
Okay, so he had 3 contentions, right? And not a really clear narrative. Like, obviously it was all centered around Venezuela, but it jumped from like price controls to oil to whatever his second contention was. I wasn't really paying attention. And then so he's going to have 3 separate impacts, and I can almost guarantee you right now they're going to collapse under the third contention, right? It was going to be the longest. The first 2 were pretty short, so they were like the time sucks I was talking about before, right? So like the other team's going to have to respond to them in rebuttal, but they're probably just going to kick them as soon as summary begins.
I'm a little confused in the first contention. Like I my pen wasn't writing, so I missed what it like was about in the beginning. But like, what was the main argument?
Anyone who flowed got that? Because I was not flowing. Or are we all confused on their main contention?
Like I got that it said the sanctions like reduce Maduro's control on his public-private circle, which is like a really common like piece of evidence. And then he was forced to like build trust in the people. And then the government like cut stuff like because of the sanctions. That's literally all I read. That didn't make sense. And then it like decreased inflation. And then the inflation is bad. It just kind of felt like it was all over the place.
Yeah, it seemed a little confusing. I was trying to write it all down, and by the time I wrote like 2 words down from one part, they completely switched to a different area.
Yeah, I feel like they just said like 10 different facts and like didn't connect any of it. Oh, and my computer's like frozen again. Oh no.
Oh, unlucky. So he was a lot faster, right? So he probably read like 750 to 800 words. But it was still like a hearable speed. It just, when someone's talking that fast, you're going to have to probably not flow every single card, right? So there was a lot of cards that were just like contextualization that I would not write down because I've debated this topic before, so I know them, right? Like there's some pretty basic stuff like Maduro implemented price control. Probably not going to write that down because I know that. So I'm going to take more time writing down like the important stuff. Also, if you notice in between cards, you put some analytics in. Right, so that takes up like word count, but it also, if you like looked at his third contention, it was more fleshed out, kind of a lot more easier to understand than his first contention was a lot more tech and just cards. All right, so this should be the rebuttal because no one cares about Crossfire. So we're flowing that next to constructed of what we just did. So when you're flowing this, try to use arrows to signify like what exactly he's responding to. Also, it's easier if you just write, instead of like indict, write like ID. Outweigh, figure out what you want to write for outweigh. D-link, I put DL. Also, if he's going to say like 3 responses, it makes it easier if you just number them, right? Like put first response, 1, circle it, and then flow whatever he's writing. Second response, blah, blah, blah. Okay, everyone ready?
My opponent's ready. Last. Judges. Start on their first contention. 2 pieces of weighing. The first is on urgency. They're trying to say in the long run they can improve Venezuela's economy, but we tell you that the effects of malnourishment compound because when people are stunted now and we don't solve that stunting, it causes long-term growth problems that will cost Venezuela's economy $480 billion in the long run. That prevents the type of growth that they're talking about. The second thing is that they have to prove that things are actually getting better in their world. We tell you, according to the IMF, that the GDP of Venezuela is projected to decline by 20% in 2020. 5 million more refugees are projected to flee, and oil revenues are projected to decline by an additional 50%. That means that even if there are better rules in the economy, if there's a fewer supply of food and medicine, that means people are still not going to be better off. And the way that they get this food and medicine is with oil revenues. Then go to the.
Okay, so that was an overview, right? That was a weighing overview. First one was like they basically cross-applied their own case. The first one was saying like why the impacts weren't that important. And then the second like point in their overview was a uniqueness saying like how nothing's going to change from the status quo. So when you flow your case, like a case, you should leave some space at the top, right? Because when you were flowing his overview right there, you took up like space from the first contention, right? So now like it's going to be weird with arrows, right? So leave that space at the top if someone's going to read an overview like that. Also, he's just talking fast, so try to keep up. Everyone ready?
Their first point about liberalization. They talk about a couple of reforms that Maduro is doing. The first is on price controls. We tell you that price controls being lifted wasn't good. As PBS says, 93% of people cannot afford the prices of these food without price controls. We tell you that previously the government was able to subsidize food so that the producers could still make a profit despite price controls. In fact, the IMF tells you 80% of all food was subsidized before sanctions. But now the subsidization is going away and they are less able to give people cheaper food. But then the second point they talk to you about is about currency controls. But we tell you that we tell you according to Reuters that Venezuela Venezuela, even though they withdrew the law that prevented them from lending in banks, they've only lended $32 million in the dollar. Most of the dollarization that we're now seeing in the economy is a result of the $5 billion of remittances that are coming in every year, but Maduro can't stop that. We also tell you at the end of the day, things are not getting better for most people. According to Rodriguez of Harvard, hyperinflation is projected to double in 2020, and we also tell you all these reforms are unlikely to be reversed. If they are helping the economy now, Maduro is unlikely to just stop them and say we are no longer going to do these reforms. They've found new sources of revenue. He's going to continue them in the next year. But then, even if sanctions are lifted, then go to their second point about blocking aid. A few responses. First of all, their evidence just says we imposed sanctions to try because we were mad about them blocking aid. It doesn't say that the reason that they stopped blocking aid was because of sanctions. There's no warranting here. It's not like they expected that if they stopped blocking aid, the sanctions would get lifted. They weren't. It was in fact just international pressure and Maduro wanting to make sure his image wasn't I'm blocking aid. They also say 650,000 people were given aid, but the Red Cross said they only actually reached 50,000, and at the end of the day, it's just a band-aid solution. 80% of people were getting food from the government. Now like 50,000 people are getting food from aid. That's not enough. Then go to their third point about oil. First they tell you that right now they are privatizing the oil sector. First of all, the warranting why they're privatizing the oil sector is that they destroy the oil sector. So they're conceding the link in our case. Don't let them read blocks saying that sanctions don't destroy the oil sector. But then second of all, they have to tell you how much is getting better under privatization. We tell you that the privatization is fundamentally still invested in the government. As Venezuela analysis tells you that the government is maintaining a majority stake in these ventures. We also tell you that they've already signed these contracts, so they can't reverse the privatization, and that they're not even fully privatized. We also tell you, according to Brookings, that we cut them off from $10.9 billion in joint ventures with the U.S. due to sanctions. And we also tell you it doesn't matter because even if they privatize, because even if the output increases, they're not getting money. Because Reuters tells you that the countries they're now selling oil to that aren't the U.S. are giving them debt forgiveness, not cash. That means they don't have the money, A, to invest in diversification, but B, don't have the money to buy imports, which is why we tell you that the sanctions cost them $17 billion in oil revenue, and they went from producing 3.3 million barrels a day to just 600 to 700,000 barrels a day, even at the end of this year. But then they tell you that they're going to privatize the rest of the economy and diversify. According to Fox News, that's not true because they used oil revenue previously under previous administrations to successfully diversify. As Fox tells you, in 2014, 70% of their GDP was in the private sector. Now it's just 25%. But then we also tell you that according to Brookings Institute, that they're still getting 98% of their revenue from the oil sector. They just say there was a 155% increase in these other exports, but that was due specifically in their card due to them selling off gold exports, not due to investing in agriculture. But then second of all, according to the Brookings Institute, they need oil revenue to diversify. In 2010, only 48% of their revenue is coming from gold, is coming from oil because they were able to diversify. Now it's 98%. And in 2013, they were able to increase non-oil exports by 75% simply because they were being able to use the money from these oil revenues. That's important because we tell you the internal link to being able to diversify is having foreign reserves. When we cut those foreign reserves in half, they're not able to. They also can't receive as much investment. As the New York Times tells you again, we cut them off from $10.9 billion in joint ventures from the U.S. And then they say it causes corruption. We tell you about coercion versus co-option. When he was able to have the oil revenue, he gave 80% of people food, he cut hunger in half. Now he's using more coercive methods. The corruption doesn't end. Thus, we urge you to affirm.
Can I see the diversification?
Okay, so you guys looked really lost when it got fast, right?
I can talk really fast and my brain goes fast and I can understand people talking fast, but that was insane. I couldn't even understand what he was saying.
Yeah, so like when you get good, it's going to be really helpful to be able to talk fast. So since he knows his blocks, he's like when you're reading, he's not actually understanding what he's saying. He's just reading words.
But then what's the point of that? Like no one can flow that or like understand what he's saying.
So if I were flowing this, like a lot of the stuff he says, like I don't need to understand the specifics. Like I don't really care if it's like $2 million versus like $3 million. I understand what he's saying, right? Like his rebuttal, I understand it. I've probably heard it before, so I understand the front line to it. And I can ask him about it in Crossfire. Like I can say, I missed that. Could you repeat that? Also, if you're going up against a team that's really fast, you can just yell clear and they're supposed to slow down. You can ask for a speech doc if they're going super fast. And like if they're going really fast and they don't do anything about it, you could read theory, which we'll talk about at a later date. So you notice like during his rebuttal, right, he didn't really read blocks until the third contention. A lot of his responses were cross-applying his own case to their case, and then a lot of analytics. He also used like the phrase a lot, they have no warranting, right? So like I said, that's going to be really important because like the neg team just says that like oil prices are going down. He explains why oil prices are going down and actually turns the link to their case. Did we all like catch that happening? Okay, so I'm pretty sure she also goes just as fast, if not faster.
I didn't get. I wrote down like one thing for that. So yeah.
Let's see, 24:33. So you'll notice she will most likely frontline first. I think I probably skipped ahead before they do it, but they should be giving order. Like before they start their speech, they'll just say what they're going down. I think she's about to say it here. Okay, everyone ready? This should make it easier for you to flow. Also, notice he didn't really signpost at all, and it was really confusing. So, like, obviously, if you're a judge, it's just going to be even more confusing for you.
One step, sorry. Yeah, you're good. Yeah, you're good.
Are we good? Judges? Start on the urgency wing. We are the prerequisite. The NISBRG evidence is conceded on a case that says that Maduro is going into agriculture, which means if we're growing more food, we're solving the malnourishment problem. But secondly, their second piece of weighing is that we have to prove the situation is getting better. That's not true. Our argument is that reliance on oil has caused the boom-bust cycle in Venezuela's economy. This inherently means that they are not diversified. This is important, because Kamzyshev tells us that in the 1950s, Venezuela was on track to be one of the wealthiest nations in the world. In fact, he tells you that it was oil dependency that put them on a 70-year track to poverty, which means if we are solving the root cause of this argument, we are solving all these structural harms that led Venezuela into poverty today. Then, they read this turn on our first contention that...
Okay, so they respond to overview right there, right? So if she didn't like respond to that overview, it's going to be really hard for them to win the round later, like in the second half of the round, right? Because they already have weighing down that goes unresponded to, so the judge is going to have to prefer that way. Also, you notice how she's like talking probably just as fast, but she's a lot easier to understand.
Yeah.
It's probably because she knows her case better, and she's done like fluency drills. So there's drills like that you can talk with a pen in your mouth, and you'll be able to enunciate better. So she's probably like done that and just understands her case better, so she can talk off the top of her head where he like bumbles around a lot. And she also had more prep time, so that probably plays into it. All right, everyone good?
That price controls make food unaffordable. A, we tell you there's shortage of Venezuelans poverty. 70-year track to poverty, which means if we are solving the root cause of this argument, we are solving all these structural harms that led Venezuela into poverty today. Then, they read this turn on our first contention that price controls make food unaffordable. A, we tell you there's shortages before, which means at best this argument is a wash. But B, we tell you from Reuters in 2019 there's been a 16.5% increase in public sector imports, including food. Then, go to our third contention. Concede the argument that they're getting money off of gold exports. This is really important because we would tell you that this is the money that they're using to diversify, which takes out their first argument about debt and like oil revenue being used to pay back debt. Even then, they tell you that oil revenue is necessary to diversify the economy. This isn't true. All other instances of diversification always led to a fall back into more reliance, which is why today there's still 96% rely on oil. That is why the Mallet evidence tells us that specifically sanctions are an economic straitjacket on Venezuela that apply long-term continued pressure that force them to invest in the long-term into better sectors, and in the long term you can also extend the NISBRG evidence that tells us that right now they're developing agriculture. Extend all the impact evidence that's conceded. Then.
Okay, so you notice she kicked the second contention, didn't respond to anything at all. Probably wanted to kick the first contention too, but she had to respond to that turn, right? Because that's independent offense. And then her speech is so much easier to understand because she's telling you exactly where to go, right? As a judge, she says first contention, responds, like tells you what they said, then explains why they're wrong. Goes third contention, explains like the three things they said, explains why they're wrong, right? That's really easy to integrate in your speech and makes it a lot easier, as like you probably understand by now, to flow. All right, so now we're going on to their case.
Go to their case. At the top, on Petrocaribe, 3 responses. First, Petrocaribe first failed because of corruption. What Rolls tells us in 2019 is that decreasing oil production after years of mismanagement led to the indefinite suspension of exports to 8 Petrocaribe nations of Venezuela. But secondly, more importantly, Statgardner tells us in 2017 that Mexico will always fill in the gap and provide oil to these countries. But third, more importantly, Petrocaribe wasn't actually working. Nugent tells us in 2018 that because it wasn't conventional aid, there was no transparency and no oversight, which means all of the impacts were corrupt. Then, go to their second argument about cutting a lifetime. Both of their internal links to this case are just link magnifiers for the evidence in our case that tells you that sanctions are an economic straitjacket on Venezuela, which has for the first time ever committed them to diversify. But even then, there are two alternative causes as to oil being harmed. First, Rapier tells us in 2019 that there is no reinvestment back into the oil sector, but secondly, more importantly, he also continues that there's a lot of brain drain, which means there's no expertise. But then, they tell you that all the oil revenue is really good because it's used to pay for food and medicine, but they're not winning the incentive debate. Two problems here. First, Maduro funnels all his money into paying off his military and oil sector, which isn't good. But secondly, more importantly, the USEC tells us in 2019 that Maduro has literally embezzled $2 billion for his own purposes, so like they're not solving the oil revenue, which will just directly go into the people. But then, they read that there's been a decrease in imports, but again, they're not solving for the root cause. We tell you that the root cause of import dependency for food and medicine in Venezuela is the fact that they're too reliant on oil, which means they don't have domestic sectors, which is why our argument is about developing other public sectors that already exist, like agriculture, and solving the root cause of this problem. Then, go to their first impact about healthcare. Realize the problem is Maduro. What Casey tells us in 2016 is that Maduro blocked legislation that would have allowed him to declare a public health emergency in Venezuela, which would have allowed in a lot of international aid. That means that we also control the link in because we create more international pressure to let them lead in. We can increase the severity of all the sanctions to like create more pressure. But then, on their second impact, which is probably what they're going for because it's all they're weighing at the top of our case, on empty stomachs. Realize that the Financial Times evidence and the World Health Organization evidence that I call for all talk about starting in 2013, which is when Maduro took office. That means that these problems existed before. In fact, the World Health evidence looks at 2017, which was pre-sanction, and tells us that 1/3 of the children population was stunted. That means that they don't solve for the root cause. Even if they went to pre-sanctioned world, they wouldn't be solving for these people that were stunted. That means also, again, we have the only risk of solvency because if we can create more food by building up the agricultural sector where all of the demand for food is domestic, we're still solving this problem.
All right, so I'm pretty sure we all would agree that her rebuttal was a lot better for us to flow and understand, right? So that's because when I was talking about the just laying down a bunch of responses or the submarine thing, you could see she went for the specific links in their case instead of just putting down a bunch of responses. So a couple of things I would critique on her, when she was frontlining her own case, she just said extend our impacts, right? So just saying extending your impacts, I guess it does the job, but it doesn't really tell the judge what your impacts are. And I don't really think it's a good extension because you didn't explain it. So I understand she's frontlining in her rebuttal, so she doesn't really have time. But if that was in summary, that would be really bad because that's not really extending. Then she goes on to their case. I said, it's pretty easy to understand what they're going to go collapse on because of that overview. She recognizes that, so she spends more time on their impacts there, right? She goes at every level of their link. She goes from claim, warrant, and then to impact. During his rebuttal, he doesn't interact with their impacts at all. He tries to take out their chain at the link level. Anyone have any thoughts, comments on that rebuttal?
I think it was definitely easier to understand, but it was still kind of fast.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so like I said, summary, most important part of the round, you'll see that he's going to collapse, frontline, and then also probably do weighing, I'd assume at the end of his speech. And I'm also going to assume it's going to be slower than what a rebuttal is because, as I said, it's really important that the judge understands what you're going for. Okay.
My judges. Okay. First, on the way, they tell you that Maduro is investing in agriculture. This is going to solve the food crisis. A couple of responses. The evidence just says that he should invest, not that he is. Second, it's going to take too much time. All of Venezuela's agriculture added together right now can only feed 30% of the population. It's urgent to get these children food imports right now because if they don't get that food, they're going to be stunted in the long term. That's going to cost the economy of Venezuela $480 billion in the long term, short-circuiting all their economic reforms. And we can reverse stunting. It's a reversible process. And third and finally, they don't give you any warning as to why, if he's diversifying now, he would then reverse that process. Then they tell you in the 1950s that Venezuela used to be the wealthiest, now it's the poorest. Well, it was projected to be the wealthiest because of its oil wealth, and it's the poorest now mainly because of sanctions. So what's the story here? In 2014, oil prices dipped a little bit, the economic crisis began. But Venezuela would have recovered as oil prices rose. The problem is we slapped sanctions on Venezuela, and we were their largest buyer. And that created a huge economic loss for Venezuela, which is essentially exponentially a petrol state. They lost $17 billion, a decrease in production 5 times greater than anything that it had seen in its history. They tell you that, oh, oil was going down anyway, there wasn't enough investment. But the lack of investment in the oil sector, according to Rodriguez of Harvard, only explains 15% of the decline in overall production. And then they say there was brain drain, but that existed before. Before sanctions, they were producing 3.3 million barrels of oil, now just 600,000. Clearly, sanctions had a significant impact. It's the same link that they're going for. Then they tell you that Maduro wastes a lot of this money. But 90% of oil revenue goes towards social programs. What's the warranty here? Maduro might be trying to be an autocrat, but he's trying to co-opt the population by giving them many handouts, and that overall was working before sanctions. 8 out of every 10 Venezuelans were getting free food, and in the first 2 years of Maduro's reign, he cut hunger in half. Yes, there might have been some shortages, but overall the situation was markedly better. The problem is now, because of sanctions, he had to slash imports by 71%, specifically for food, and that's spiked malnutrition from 6 to 21%, with 280,000 children on the brink of dying, 1/3 of them stunted. Yes, a lot of these kids were stunted before, but since sanctions, the malnourishment has quadrupled, and we would argue that even if they were stunted before, if we can get food imports back into the country, we can feed these children, and the harms don't have to be long-term. Stunting is not an irreversible process. Now let's move on.
So he just spent like that time frontlining, right? Like he said what they said, explained what they said, and then explained why he is still correct. And he did a bit of weighing at the top, but I assume he's going to get to that later.
Move on to their case. The crux of their case is that right now Venezuela is going to be diversifying. But their only evidence on this question is that Venezuela used its last remaining gold reserve to get some money from Turkey. That's not a sustainable diversification strategy, and insofar as sanctions have cut off half of their overall reserve dollars, that means they can't adequately diversify their economy. They were diversifying much better prior to sanctions, when they had much more money from oil revenue. In fact, back prior to sanctions, we saw 70% of their GDP in the private sector because the government was subsidizing private businesses in an effort to diversify. Now, after sanctions, only 20% of GDP is in the private sector because the government is no longer subsidizing these kinds of private ventures. It's trying to hoard the money because now, instead of co-opting the population, Maduro has become more of an autocrat, and he's coercing the population, holding onto power in any way that he possibly can. And the final trend that they never respond to is that you need investment for this kind of diversification, and sanctions cut off $10.9 billion worth of investment into Venezuela by preventing banks and other financial institutions from loaning to the government and helping to diversify the economy. For these reasons, please affirm.
Right, so he didn't really weigh at all, right? Like, he didn't really do anything on that, but he did bring up a turn that they dropped. So like I was saying, you can literally just tell the judge, like, they messed up, they didn't talk about that. So I'm not sure if that's true, if they necessarily did talk about it. Another thing that he didn't do was he didn't really cite any of his evidence, right? He just explained it with words, but he didn't name like the card or who said it, which might be a bit confusing if the judge is flowing, saying like citing the card and then writing. So instead, like him just saying they're diversifying because of blah, 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 blah. Now I have to look through my flow to figure out where I wrote down they're diversifying because of blah, 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 right? Instead of just saying like New York Times 18. Does that make sense? Like it's harder to follow, but it also makes it more like a fluent speech, I guess. Okay, everyone ready?
Sorry, let me see. The first issue is that Maduro embezzles money. The issue with their evidence where they talk about 90% going to welfare and going to food programs is that the 90% comes from pre-Maduro. This is a different situation. We would argue that Maduro specifically is embezzling money. If he's already embezzled $2 billion, he would embezzle more. That being said, they try to say that 90% goes to the impoverished. Even if you believe this evidence, there's two responses. The first is that embezzlement obviously isn't going to be in the government spreadsheet, it's undercover. But second of all, the goal is to get off of the lifeline of food. Our argument is that 8 out of 10 people shouldn't have to be on free food. There should be jobs and there should be agricultural growth so that doesn't have to occur. That being said, there's still a few things to know when you talk about their. First is the Reuters terminal defense. This was actually started on our case, but you can apply to their case because the public sector is increasing with food, 16.5% increase in imports of food. What that means is that there is food increasing over. But even if you want to talk about their impacts, this is when you should consider their evidence. All of their evidence is very, very sketchy. For example, the Financial Times and the World Health Organization all come from 2013, all come from pre-sanctions. None of their evidence is very recent. And even then, we would argue that before sanctions, 33% were stunted. You should at very least have a low probability of this impact. But let's go to the weighing, and this is where it gets a little bit confusing. They try to say that this urgency weighing is the most important thing because we need to stop stunting right now, but our response is very, very clear. If 1/3 of kids are stunted pre-sanctions, that means that we must stop the oil bust because the oil bust is what's putting these kids into these situations where they are stunted. That being said, we would argue that our contention, third contention, is a prerequisite because these structural issues that Venezuela is so reliant on oil, anytime there's an oil bust or a boom, their economy changes drastically, and that's when stunting occurs. Our argument is that every oil bust is the same crisis, so any risk of our case solving the oil bust is a reason to vote for us. Let's go to our third contention. Our contention is that if oil is unreliable, then sanctions force diversification because there's no profit. They diversify to other sectors with domestic demand because that's how they make investment. They have three responses. The first is one is not sustainable. Our argument is that one, their own evidence says that they have reserves up to 10 billion or even more. But second of all, the other more intuitive thing is that investment leads to more profit. More profit is more reinvestment. And we would say because the demand is domestic, that is obviously going to be the case. The second and third are about privatization and investment. But this is interesting because our Brookings evidence is explaining that even when the private sector is owned, or even when the private sector is operated, it's owned by Maduro because they all rely on subsidies. That being said, they have no offense here, but even on investment, it's all domestic sector, it's all public sector, there's no private investment. This is when you can extend our link. When we explain that resource dependency is what put Venezuela on this path to poverty, and Mal explains that this sanctions and Venezuela's reliance on oil is a straitjacket, committing them to diversify into agriculture. That being said, with investment, the sector and agriculture sector increases. That is very productive because more production in the agriculture industry is beneficial. As Kakanov explains, if oil share increases 10%, GDP decreases in the long run by 7%. That is how we link in. But even then, this crisis started in 2014. Our argument is we stop the next 50 crises of oil bust. Vote for us and you vote for long-term solvency.
All right. What did we think about that?
I thought that made some sense. I mean, it was easier to understand than everything else.
I think weighing the long-term solvency over like short-term solvency was really, really helpful in bringing out their case.
So he laid out a pretty clear weighting mechanism that will probably be extended in final focus. I think he made a new response to all their evidence, right? He tried to read this indictment about it being old stuff. I think that's late to read in second summary because they can't really respond to it. So I don't think he should have read that. I guess you could, but I don't think it's the best thing to do. He does a really good job of explaining his case, right? For me, it seemed like he said a lot more in the same amount of time than the other summary did. That just comes down to word economy, right? So he picked and chose the words more carefully. He was able to get his point across in fewer amount of words, and that's ends up making it sound clearer and cleaner. Okay, final focus is 49-49. Okay, so at this point in the round, who do you think is winning?
After summary, I think people on the left.
The neg? We all think that?
I don't know. My computer is messed up, so I pretty much missed all of rebuttal. So I don't know.
Okay, here's final focus.
All right. You guys ready? Last judges. Start on the weighing. They say that if he invests in agriculture, he diversifies the industry, it gets better in the long run. But we tell you there is urgency here. The domestic agriculture can only feed 30% of the population. We need to be able to get food imports now to reverse stunting and stop the malnourishment. Because as we say, and they don't contest malnourishment, this stunting will cost them $480 billion in the long term, which kicks out of all the economic benefits. They just say the stunting was there before. But our whole warrant is that without sanctions, we can double oil production, we get them more revenue that they can use to invest in food imports. And if they do so, we can reverse this stunting. They just tell you the whole crisis was due to the fact that there's a boom and bust cycle, and that's always going to harm Venezuela. But they don't don't respond to the fact that we tell you that even that oil prices rebounded after 2014 and they would have recovered, which is why over the long run Venezuela was doing well even with their oil revenue. And that's why we say that sanctions specifically prevented that recovery, because they took them out of their main trading partner with oil, and they cut, which led to oil production declining 5 times faster than it was otherwise going to, which led to, remember, a vast loss in oil revenue, and then that oil, including a 71% decline in food imports, and previously 80% of people were getting free food. Maduro cut hunger in half, even despite these boom and bust cycles, and we say that 95% of the dollar need for food and medicine specifically came from oil, and we say that the reasoning is co-option, which they don't contest. Then we tell you that when we end sanctions, we can reverse this, because sanctions cause malnutrition to quadruple, and we tell you as a result, this is reversible as without sanctions they can get more revenue, we can reverse the stunting. Then go to their case. A few things. Let me tell you that they have terrible evidence. They say they should invest in agriculture. They don't show you how much they're investing in agriculture. They only show that public sector imports went up. That's because they sold some of the last gold revenue from Turkey. They just say profit makes more profit, but not in a poor country like Venezuela. They're not making that much profit, and they only have less than $10 billion of reserves compared to $42 billion before. They also never responded to the fact they were diversifying before. Remember, they went from 70% private before sanctions to now 25% private, and the oil revenue went from 48% of government for GDP to 98%. Remember the coercion and co-option warranty, which is that right now as he loses revenue, instead of co-opting the people, he has to coerce them, and the governance just gets worse, and instead of diversifying. And we also tell you that they got $10.9 billion of investment from the U.S. that was going to be used to privatize. This got cut off from sanctions. Thus, we urge you to affirm.
Okay. Okay, it's going to start on their case weighing our case. Is everybody good? Everyone? The Reuters evidence is conceded in Final Focus that tells us that in 2019, public sector imports, including food, increased by 16.5%. That is terminal defense on their link. But the other terminal piece of defense is the weighing. Weighing is terminal defense. Look at their argument. Their argument is that people were stunted and starving for 4 years pre-sanctions, and then sanctions prevented a rebound. Why could they be starving for 4 years before? Our argument is fundamentally a prerequisite, because we account for the fact that every single oil bust is going to cause these same problems and stunting and have people starve for 4 years. This is really important, because that means even a risk at solving these structural problems that lead to people stunting and starving for 4 years every 10 years is a reason to vote for us. So, insofar as we were winning the prerequisite weighing, if we were winning a risk on our case, we were winning the round. Let's go to our case. They extend a couple of things in Final Focus. First, they say that the economy was diversifying into the private sector before. A, our argument is specifically about public sector development, but B, more importantly, the Brookings evidence goes conceded that tells us that the reason the private sector is bad is because they're all reliant on government subsidies, which means that all just report back to Maduro and there's actually no diversification. But then, more importantly, we tell you specifically the agriculture is a good sector because they just need an initial fund to get the agricultural sector running, and then because all the demand is domestic and the production is domestic, the agricultural sector pays for itself. This is conceded. So, let's go to our link. You can just vote off of it right here. First, the Mallet evidence tells us that economic sanctions have been a straitjacket on Venezuela, which is forcing them to commit to diversification for the first time. Then, NISBERG tells us the agriculture is the sector to be developed, which is why they're trying to increase productivity in this sector. Overall, all of the impact evidence is also conceded. For example, Kakanoff tells us that a 10% increase in oil share decreases GDP by 7%, which is the best long-term solvency. But moreover, we tell you that any diversification at all stops the boom and bust cycle in the Venezuelan economy that is literally the root cause of everybody starving everybody 10 years and all of the stunting that is happening. This weighing doesn't get responded to, so that ends the round.
All right, so after that, who do we think? What are our thoughts?
Next one.
Okay, I'm pretty sure it was a 2-1 for the ACT. I wasn't flowing it, but I think most of the judges there were pretty tech, so they looked mostly on the flow. The Final Focus for the neg was really good, right? So we see that she clearly explains everything in like a really short amount of time. She does a really good job weighing and explaining like what the implications of the round mean, right? So she explains like why malnourishment isn't going to change. She does a really good job of extending that through rebuttal, through summary, and then through Final Focus. Like Andrew, that's their summary speaker, does a really good job of like following that through, right? So we understand that there's a clear picture throughout the round. The AF team doesn't really have like a clear cohesion for me. It makes it hard to like figure out what they're going for in Final Focus because they ramble on about and like muck up their words. And I also don't think they have a clear weighing mechanism that is well extended, right? They bring this up, like overview up in rebuttal, but I don't think it's well extended in summary or Final Focus. They just say, like, they just throw out the word like urgency weighing, but I don't think they really implicate why that's important. Where like there's Neg second speaker really explains and warrants out why that's the most, like why her impact is the most important. Any thoughts, questions?
I thought she did a good job, like in the end. I don't know. Don't know if this is right, but I thought she did a good job, like saying that, like their argument like didn't fix like the root problems, because that I felt like that kind of negated their entire case.
Yeah, like she really like talks to the judge, right? She says like their argument doesn't make sense. She says that really early. Then she just like says the word terminal defense a lot, then explains why it's terminal defense, says outweighs, explain why outweighs, and like says that it ends the round there, right? So she does a really good job of like walking the judge through the round and really writing the judge's ballot. Okay, so I think that's it for today. I don't know if we're supposed to go back to the main room. Let's go back to the main room and figure it out. Okay, guess not. Okay, bye.